Judge mocks a quiet black teen in court, stunned to discover he's a genius. The courtroom was suffocating, not with the weight of justice, but with the electric charge of a spectacle. It was a crowd that had come not for fairness, not for the solemn weight of the law, but for entertainment. They had come to see another young black boy fall, just another statistic in an open and shut case. Jaden Cole stood at the center of it all, motionless, his thin frame swallowed by an oversized, wrinkled button-down shirt. His hands were stuffed deep into his pockets, shoulders slightly hunched, gaze fixed on the scuffed wooden floor beneath his feet. The cuffs of his sleeves were frayed, his sneakers worn. He looked like nothing, like no one. To them, he was just another troubled kid, another quiet, withdrawn black boy who probably thought himself smarter than he was. On the elevated bench above, Judge Richard Hamilton sat like a king on his throne. He didn't believe in rehabilitation, didn't believe in second chances, not for kids like Jaden. To him, there were two kinds of people in this world, those who upheld the law and those who were destined to break it, and Hamilton had no patience for the latter. He leaned forward now, his lips curling into something that wasn't quite a smile. Well, well, he mused, his voice rich with amusement. A hacker, a criminal, and now, a mute? Laughter rippled through the courtroom, a wave of low chuckles from the jury box, quiet sneers from the prosecution's table. The reporters, hungry for drama, scribbled furiously in their notebooks, their cameras poised, waiting for the moment when the boy would finally crack. Jaden remained still. From the back of the room, he could hear whispers, murmurs disguised as casual observations, but dripping with the same old assumptions. Look at him. Doesn't even react. Maybe he really is autistic. Nah, he knows exactly what he did. Typical. Playing the victim. The prosecutor, a sharp-eyed man in a navy blue suit, leaned back in his chair with a smirk. He had played this game before. He knew exactly how to control the narrative, how to twist a boy's silence into guilt. Judge Hamilton tapped his gavel once. "Tell me, Mr. Cole," he drawled, exaggerating the title as though it were undeserved. "Do you even understand where you are?" The question was met with silence. Jaden didn't flinch, didn't shift. His face remained unreadable, his posture unchanged. A beat of quiet stretched. Hamilton exhaled through his nose, shaking his head in mock disappointment. "What a shame," he sighed theatrically, glancing toward the jury. "A boy like this? He could have done something productive with his life. Instead, here we are." More laughter, a slow, calculated humiliation. And still Jaden waited. Not out of fear, not out of submission. He was waiting for the right moment. Then it came. Judge Hamilton let the silence settle, let the condescension soak in, before delivering what he thought would be the final blow. He adjusted his posture, squared his shoulders, and asked as though it was a mere formality, "Well, do you have anything to say for yourself?" Jaden lifted his head, not slowly, not hesitantly, but with the kind of deliberate motion that made the air in the room shift. Dark eyes, sharp and unblinking, locked onto Hamilton's. For the first time that day, silence spread in a different way. Not as an absence of noise, but as a presence of something unspoken. The judge's smirk wavered. The prosecutor stiffened. A juror shifted in their seat. Something had changed, and everyone felt it. Jaden inhaled, his breath steady, his expression unreadable. And then finally he spoke. His voice was calm, controlled, but his words landed like a hammer. "Your Honor," he said, his tone cutting through the tension like a blade, "if you're done mocking me, can I correct the mistake in your ruling before you send an innocent man to prison?" The room stood still. A second passed. Then another. Judge Hamilton's fingers tightened around the edge of his bench. The prosecutor's mouth opened slightly, as if searching for a response but coming up empty. Somewhere in the gallery someone coughed. For the first time since the trial began, the power in the room had shifted. But before Jaden found himself standing in that courtroom, before the world labeled him a criminal, he had already spent years fighting a quieter, more insidious battle. One where the enemy wasn't the law, but the very system that refused to see him for who he truly was. Jaden Cole had always been an anomaly, a mind wired for logic in a world governed by chaos. From the moment he could process thought, Numbers made more sense than people. Patterns spoke to him in ways words never could. By the age of 6, he could dismantle an old computer and rebuild it with missing parts, his fingers moving with the precision of someone who understood machinery more than human interaction. But the world didn't celebrate children like him. It scrutinized them. It feared them. And in Jaden's case, it dismissed them entirely. He was never the kid who fit in. He didn't run on the basketball courts with the other boys, didn't jump into playground conversations, didn't fake laughter to fit in with the noise. He wasn't shy. He simply didn't see the point of pointless things. While the others wasted time gossiping about TV shows and video games, Jaden was buried in coding books and algorithms, pushing himself further into a world of structure and certainty. And the world hated him for it. That kid ain't right. Why doesn't he talk like the others? Maybe he's autistic or something. They never asked him. They never tried to understand. It was easier to slap a label on him, easier to turn his silence into a diagnosis than admit they simply weren't capable of seeing what he was. At school, things were worse. Teachers mistook his lack of participation for defiance, his quietness for arrogance. When he finished tests faster than anyone else, when his assignments came back flawless, they questioned him, not with admiration, but suspicion. "Jaden, are you sure you didn't have help with this?" "Jaden, no one gets a perfect score every time." He did, because he understood things they couldn't, but it didn't matter, because they didn't want a genius. They wanted a problem. Lisa Cole, his mother, fought for him the best she could. A single mother working 2 jobs, cleaning offices by day and waiting tables by night, she knew the world would never be kind to a black boy who was too smart for his own good. "Baby, you gotta talk more. People don't trust silence. I talk when I have something to say. That's not how the world works, Jaden." She was right, and she knew it long before he did. The first time Jaden was sent to the principal's office, it wasn't for fighting, it wasn't for breaking rules, it was for correcting a teacher in class. Nobody likes a smart-ass, Jaden. By the time he was 15, he had stopped trying, stopped showing his intelligence, stopped answering questions, because no one wanted to see him succeed. They just wanted to see him fall, and eventually they would get what they wanted. But no amount of resilience could change the fact that the world had already decided who Jaden was. No matter how intelligent he was, no matter how many times he proved himself, the system wasn't built for kids like him. And as he grew older, Jaden stopped trying to fit in and started looking for the truth. Because if the world refused to see him for who he was, then he would expose it for what it truly was. The night was silent except for the rhythmic tapping of keys under Jaden Cole's fingertips. His small bedroom was illuminated only by the dim glow of his laptop screen, casting eerie blue shadows across the scattered circuit boards and crumpled notes on his desk. His mother was asleep in the next room, exhausted from another double shift, and outside the distant hum of traffic pulsed like a steady heartbeat in the background. But Jaden was somewhere else, somewhere far beyond the confines of these 4 walls, deep inside the digital infrastructure of the justice system, peeling back the layers of bureaucracy like a surgeon cutting into diseased flesh. His program, Blind Justice, was something he had built out of sheer frustration. He had always known the system was broken, but knowing wasn't enough. He needed proof. Designed to sift through court records, trial transcripts, and case evidence, the program scanned for inconsistencies, discrepancies in testimony, mismatched timestamps, patterns of racial bias. It was, in Jaden's mind, a form of digital forensics, a way to expose the errors no one wanted to see. And tonight, he was running another batch of cases, expecting the usual. A pattern of over-sentencing for black defendants, suppressed evidence, procedural shortcuts that condemned the innocent. What he didn't expect was Marcus Carter. At first, it was just a red flag in the data, an anomaly, a case that shouldn't have stood out but did. Marcus Carter, a 43-year-old black man, had been convicted of armed robbery at a Wells Fargo bank in downtown Atlanta. The evidence against him had been damning. Security footage placed him at the scene, the bank teller had identified him, and the jury had taken less than 3 hours to find him guilty. A textbook conviction. Except something was wrong. Jaden frowned, pulling up the raw court files. His program had flagged an inconsistency in the timestamps. He leaned closer to the screen, scanning the metadata of the security footage. The official court records stated that Marcus Carter had entered the bank at 9:42 a.m. on the day of the robbery. That was when the video showed him stepping through the doors, a black hoodie pulled low over his face, a duffel bag slung over his shoulder. But another record, a seemingly insignificant detail buried deep within the files, contradicted that. A parking ticket, issued to Marcus Carter at 9:47 a.m. Across town, Jaden's fingers moved faster now, pulling up a city map, cross-referencing the locations. The parking ticket had been issued at a gas station nearly 7 miles away. Impossible. No human being could be in two places at once. His breath caught. Something was off. Something deliberate. He ran another check, this time isolating the footage itself. His program dissected the video frame by frame, analyzing its digital fingerprint. And then he saw it. The timestamp in the footage had been altered. It was subtle, so subtle that without blind justice, no one would have noticed. But Jaden knew how digital logs worked, how compression artifacts and frame data left behind invisible traces. The footage had been tampered with. Someone had gone into the raw video file and manually changed the timestamp to make it look like Marcus Carter had been at the scene of the crime. Jaden felt his pulse quicken. This wasn't just an error. This was fraud. Someone had framed Marcus Carter, and the system had swallowed the lie whole. His mind raced. If he had just found this tonight, that meant no one else had. That meant Carter was sitting in a prison cell right now for a crime he didn't commit. That meant a man had lost years of his life because someone, somewhere, had decided he was guilty before the trial even began. Jaden's stomach twisted. He knew how the system worked. He had seen it his entire life. Guilty until proven innocent, if you were black. Marcus Carter hadn't stood a chance. The air in the room felt thin. He sat back, staring at the screen, his mind racing through possibilities. What could he do? If he exposed this, would anyone even listen? He was just a kid, a black teenager with a laptop. He had no authority, no credibility. He could go to a lawyer, a journalist. But what if they dismissed him? What if they didn't care? Or worse, what if the people who did this found out he was looking? The weight of the discovery pressed down on him. He had a choice. He could close the laptop, pretend he never saw it, walk away before it became dangerous. Or he could do what he knew was right. Jaden exhaled sharply. His fingers hovered over the keyboard for a second, then moved. Decisive, quick. He copied the files to an encrypted drive, backed them up, ran a deeper search, tracing the digital fingerprints left behind in the altered footage. He needed to find out who had done this. And then, as his program ran the analysis, something flickered on his screen. A name, Mitchell Graves. Jaden's breath stalled. Graves was the assistant district attorney, a man with power, connections, the ability to shape court cases before they even reached trial. A man who had everything to lose if someone uncovered the truth. Jaden's heart pounded. This was bigger than he thought. He wasn't just exposing a mistake. He was stepping into something dark, something that wasn't meant to be uncovered. A sudden noise outside made him flinch. A car door slamming, footsteps. Jaden's fingers moved automatically, closing the files, locking the encryption, shutting down the system. His body tensed, ears straining. It was late. No one should be outside. He crept toward the window, heart hammering, peered through the blinds. A black SUV sat parked across the street. The engine was running. Someone was inside. Jaden's stomach dropped. They knew. He barely had time to process the realization before the knock came, hard, sharp, unforgiving, against his front door. Boom, boom, boom. He froze. Then, his mother's voice, groggy with sleep. "Who is it?" Silence. Then a voice, low, cold. "Open up. Atlanta PD. Jaden's blood ran cold. He wasn't ready. He hadn't sent the files out yet. He hadn't secured the evidence. He had only just found the truth, and now they were coming to erase it." His mother moved toward the door. Jaden bolted back to his desk, fingers flying over the keyboard, scrambling to send the files to the only person he knew might listen. The pounding on the door grew louder. "Open the door now!" His heart pounded, his hands shook, and as his screen flashed, "File sent," the door burst open. Jaden didn't even have time to turn around before they were on him. His world shattered into chaos. Footsteps shuffled. His mother, Lisa Cole, was moving toward the door. He had to stop her. "Mom, wait!" Too late. The lock clicked. The door swung open, a flood of motion. Black-clad officers stormed in like a tidal wave. Weapons raised, armored vests gleaming under the dim hallway light. Lisa gasped, stumbling back as the lead officer shoved past her without hesitation. "Where is he?" Jaden barely had time to turn before a hand seized his arm, yanking him from his chair. His laptop crashed to the floor, the screen flickering violently before going dark. "Don't move!" A knee slammed into his back, forcing him to the ground. Cold metal snapped around his wrists. Lisa screamed, "Wait! Stop! He's just a kid!" Her voice was raw, desperate, but it didn't matter. It never did. Jaden's cheek pressed against the rough carpet as heavy boots shuffled around him. The room was spinning, heart hammering against his ribs, the weight of the officer's knee making it hard to breathe. "You're under arrest for unauthorized access to a government database and obstruction of justice." Obstruction of justice. The irony would have been laughable if it weren't so cruel. Jaden tried to turn his head, tried to speak, but a hand gripped the back of his neck, holding him down. Lisa lunged forward. "You can't do this. He didn't do anything." "Ma'am, step back." She didn't listen. She never would. "He's 16. He's not a criminal." The lead officer barely spared her a glance. Then he should have thought about that before hacking into federal records. Jaden gritted his teeth. They weren't here to ask questions. They weren't here for justice. They were here to end this before the truth ever saw the light of day. Lisa's voice cracked. "Please, he was trying to help someone. You don't understand." The officer's expression remained impassive, cold. "That's not my problem." Jaden's fingers curled into fists behind his back. They didn't care. They never did. Another officer moved to his laptop, lifting it from the floor, glancing at the darkened screen before turning to the lead. "System's already locked down. He must have wiped it before we got here." Jaden clenched his jaw. "Good." The lead officer sighed, motioning toward the door. "Get him up. We're done here." A pair of rough hands dragged Jaden to his feet. His wrists ached against the cuffs. His mother tried to reach for him, but an officer stepped between them. "Please," Lisa sobbed. "You can't take him." No response, no hesitation. They pulled him toward the door. The night outside was blinding. Red and blue lights bathed the street in an eerie, flickering glow. Neighbors had gathered on porches, peering through curtains, watching the black boy in handcuffs being dragged from his home like a dangerous criminal. A camera flashed. Jaden's stomach twisted. The press was here. A reporter's voice cut through the chaos. "Jaden Cole, the 16-year-old hacker accused of breaching government databases." The words blurred. His breath came in short gasps. The world around him narrowed to the weight of the cuffs, the flashing lights, the sound of his mother's voice breaking behind him. "Jaden!" He turned his head. Lisa stood on the porch, hands clasped, shoulders shaking, eyes filled with something worse than fear. Helplessness. Jaden swallowed hard. The doors of the police cruiser swung open. The officers shoved him inside. The metal cage separating the front from the back felt suffocating, the stale air thick with finality. The moment the door slammed shut, he knew. This wasn't just about him anymore. This was about silencing the truth. As the car pulled away, Jaden forced himself to breathe. The city lights blurred past the window. He closed his eyes, the weight of everything crashing over him. They thought they had won. They thought this was over. They were wrong. But exposing the truth was never going to be enough. Jaden had thought revealing the corruption would force the system to correct itself, that the evidence would speak louder than the lies. But he had underestimated just how far those in power would go to silence him. The moment he was arrested, the real battle began. Not in a courtroom, but in the shadows, where narratives were twisted, and justice was nothing more than an illusion. The media descended like vultures. By the time Jaden Cole's mugshot flashed across every major news network, the story had already been written. The truth didn't matter. What mattered was the narrative, the spectacle. Teen hacker arrested for government cybercrime. Black teen prodigy or national security threat? Did this boy attempt to hack the justice system? Headlines screamed from every screen, twisting reality into a weapon. Jaden wasn't a whistleblower exposing corruption. He wasn't a kid who had uncovered an injustice buried in the system. No, to them, he was a criminal, a threat to national security. The media framed him as a digital terrorist, an unstable genius who had breached federal databases, placing the country at risk. They called him a danger, a boy with too much knowledge, a mind that needed to be contained. And the world believed them. No one questioned it. Not the reporters reciting pre-written statements, not the legal analysts debating his motive with smug indifference, not the news anchors flashing polished smiles as they dissected his supposed crimes in between commercial breaks. The system had spoken, and the system never admitted it was wrong. Jaden sat in the darkness of his cell, stripped of everything but the silence pressing in around him. His wrists were still sore from the cuffs, his body aching from the force they had used to take him down. He didn't know how long it had been since he had last seen the sun. Hours, days? Time didn't exist here, only the cold concrete, the flickering overhead light, the metal door that never opened except to shove a tray of food inside. He wasn't in a juvenile detention center. That would have been too simple. They had locked him in solitary confinement. No phone call, no lawyer, no contact. He was 16 years old and the system had disappeared him. He had known they wouldn't play fair, but even he hadn't expected this. They had buried him alive, sealed him off from the world before he could even fight back. Every time his mother had tried to see him, she'd been turned away. Every time a lawyer had asked about his whereabouts, they were given the same answer. No comment. His mother. The thought of her hit him harder than anything else. Lisa Cole had spent her entire life fighting for him, scraping by on exhaustion and sheer willpower to give him a chance. And now she was alone. They weren't just punishing him, they were punishing her too. The threats had started the night after his arrest. Anonymous calls. Drop this, or you'll regret it. A brick through her apartment window. A message carved into the hood of her car. Know your place. She had tried to go to the police. They had laughed in her face. Jaden clenched his jaw, his fingers curling into fists. This wasn't about justice. This was about erasing him. They had turned the world against him before he had even set foot in a courtroom. They had rewritten his story, painting him as a villain while the real criminals walked free. And now, trapped in a cage built to break him, they were waiting for him to crack, waiting for him to disappear. But they had underestimated him, because Jaden Cole had spent his entire life being overlooked, being dismissed, being told he wasn't supposed to exist. And that was exactly why he wasn't afraid. But locking Jaden away in a cell wasn't enough. The system didn't just want to silence him, it wanted to make an example of him. His arrest had been the first step, but now came the real performance. A trial that was never meant to be fair, led by a judge who had already decided the verdict, and a prosecutor who was ready to twist the truth into a weapon. Jaden wasn't walking into a courtroom. He was walking into an execution. The courtroom was never meant to be a place of justice. Not for Jaden Cole, not for kids like him. From the moment he was dragged inside, wrists shackled, flanked by two officers who held him as if he were some kind of violent criminal, he knew the outcome had already been decided. The air was thick with tension, but not the kind that came from uncertainty. There was no uncertainty here, only inevitability. Judge Richard Hamilton sat high above them, draped in his black robe, fingers curled loosely around his gavel, like a man who had already won. He had presided over cases like this before, had watched countless black boys stand where Jaden now stood, had listened to their mothers beg, had seen their lawyers argue, and in the end, he had always made sure they lost. Today would be no different. The jury, a carefully selected panel of indifferent faces, sat with their hands folded, their gazes vacant. They weren't here to deliberate. They were here to nod along. And across the room, standing with the confidence of a man who had never feared consequences, was Mitchell Graves. The assistant district attorney adjusted his tie with deliberate precision, stepping forward with a smirk that barely concealed his satisfaction. He didn't need to be theatrical, and he didn't need to prove his case. The case had already been won before Jaden ever walked into this room. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury," Graves began, his voice smooth, deliberate, "what we have here is not a case of misguided youth. This is not about a teenager making a simple mistake. This is about a calculated attack on our justice system by someone who thought he was above the law." Jaden clenched his fist beneath the table. His public defender, an overworked, underpaid man who had met him exactly once before the trial, sat beside him, flipping through notes as if he had never seen them before. He hadn't spoken to Jaden that morning, hadn't asked him how he wanted to fight this, because there wasn't a fight, not a real one. Not when Graves had everything he needed to destroy him. Graves turned toward the large screen behind him, where a grainy image flickered to life. A screenshot of a terminal, a digital log of unauthorized access to the state's judicial database, and there in bold letters was Jaden Cole's IP address. Gasps rippled through the courtroom. The reporters scribbled furiously. Graves let the moment linger before continuing. "This," he said, gesturing toward the screen, "is the indisputable proof that the defendant, Jaden Cole, hacked into restricted government records. This is not speculation. This is fact." Jaden swallowed hard, his mind racing. He knew what he was looking at. He knew how easy it was to forge an IP trail, to fabricate access logs. Someone had framed him, but no one in this room cared about the truth. The jury wasn't interested in metadata or encryption keys. They weren't going to listen if he tried to explain how simple it was for someone with power to alter these records, to plant digital evidence the same way someone could plant drugs in a suspect's car. They had already made up their minds. Graves folded his hands behind his back. For weeks, the defendant ran an elaborate scheme, unlawfully accessing legal documents, tampering with court records, and even attempting to alter active cases. A blatant, calculated attempt to manipulate the system. Jaden's jaw tightened. They weren't just painting him as a hacker. They were turning him into a threat. Hamilton leaned forward. "Tell me, Mr. Graves," he said, his tone dripping with mock curiosity, "what exactly was the defendant trying to accomplish?" Graves smirked. "A good question, Your Honor." He turned back to the jury, taking a slow step toward them, lowering his voice as if he were about to reveal something sinister. This wasn't just a breach. This was an attack on justice itself. The defendant's software, the so-called blind justice program, was designed to infiltrate sensitive case files. We have reason to believe that he intended to manipulate evidence, to erase criminal records, to alter the course of active trials. He wanted to be the judge, the jury, and the executioner. The words sent a murmur through the crowd. Jaden felt the weight of them settle over him like a noose tightening around his throat. They weren't just trying to convict him. They were trying to make sure that if he walked out of this courtroom, he would never be seen as innocent again. His mother sat in the front row, her hands clasped so tightly that her knuckles had turned white. Her eyes, pleading, desperate, met his for a split second. But there was nothing she could do, nothing he could do. His lawyer finally spoke, clearing his throat as he pushed his chair back and stood. "Your Honor, if I may," Hamilton didn't even look at him. "Overruled," the judge said dismissively, before the man could finish his sentence. He turned back to Graves. "Continue." The lawyer sank back into his chair, shoulders slumping in defeat. Jaden exhaled sharply. They weren't even pretending this was a fair trial. Graves nodded, as if everything was going exactly as expected. He picked up a stack of papers, flipping through them before holding one up. "We also have records showing that, prior to his arrest, the defendant attempted to send confidential court documents to an unknown recipient, an individual whose identity remains unconfirmed. A co-conspirator, perhaps, someone who was working with him to dismantle the judicial system from the inside." The words were carefully chosen. He wasn't just trying to convict Jaden. He was trying to turn him into an enemy of the state. Hamilton clasped his hands together. "Sounds like a very serious offense," he mused. Then he turned his gaze to Jaden for the first time. "Tell me, son." The condescension made Jaden's skin crawl. Do you have anything to say for yourself? Silence. Jaden forced himself to sit still, to keep his breathing even. He could already see the headlines waiting to be written. Teen hacker shows no remorse. Dangerous cyber criminal refuses to speak in court. It didn't matter what he said. It didn't matter if he screamed that he was innocent, if he proved that the evidence had been fabricated, if he told them that everything he had done had been to expose their corruption, it wouldn't change a thing. Hamilton tilted his head. No. A pause, then the judge sighed, shaking his head. What a waste, he muttered before lifting his gavel. But Jaden wasn't here to play by their rules. They had stacked the deck against him, twisted the truth, and expected him to sit in silence as they buried him. What they didn't realize was that he had come prepared, not just to defend himself, but to turn their own lies against them. And he had come prepared. As Judge Hamilton sat back in his chair, ready to end the charade, Jaden finally moved. Slow, deliberate. He reached forward, adjusting the microphone in front of him before locking eyes with Graves, his voice calm but sharp enough to cut through the noise. Your Honor, before you send an innocent man to prison, I think you should see something first. Murmurs flickered through the courtroom. The jury shifted. The prosecution's confidence barely wavered. Hamilton exhaled, already annoyed. You've had your chance to speak, Mr. Cole. Your attorney. This isn't about me. Jaden's voice cut him off. This is about Marcus Carter. The name landed like a hammer. For a split second, the courtroom froze. The mere mention of Carter, the man whose conviction had been the catalyst for Jaden's so-called cybercrimes, was enough to send a ripple of unease through the crowd. From the prosecution's table, Graves smirked, arms crossed, feigning indifference. Marcus Carter's case has nothing to do with this trial, Your Honor. Jaden didn't look at him. His fingers flew over the keyboard, connecting his laptop to the courtroom's projector. Then you won't mind if I show the jury something, right? A flicker of hesitation crossed Graves's face. Hamilton sighed. You have 1 minute to explain yourself, Mr. Cole. Make it count. Jaden didn't hesitate. The screen behind him flickered to life, displaying a video file. The same surveillance footage that had been used to convict Marcus Carter of the Wells Fargo robbery. It showed a man entering the bank at 9:42 a.m., dressed in a black hoodie, duffel bag slung over his shoulder. This was the footage that had sealed Carter's fate. Jaden let it play for a few seconds before pulling up a second video. An identical scene, same bank, same suspect, same movements. But the timestamp? 9:47 a.m. A murmur spread through the gallery. Graves' smirk wavered. Jaden turned back to the jury, his expression unreadable. These are two different files of the same event. Two different timestamps. But according to the prosecution's case, Marcus Carter was convicted using the 9:42 a.m. footage. He clicked a few keys, zooming in. What no one bothered to check, or what someone made sure no one checked, is that the original metadata embedded in the footage doesn't match the court's version. With a keystroke, a set of digital codes flashed onto the screen. Green text spilled across the projection. Technical, unreadable to most of the people in the room. But for anyone who knew how digital forensics worked, it was damning. Jaden continued, his voice steady. What you're looking at is the raw data file from the footage presented in court. And what you'll see, if you look closely, is that the timestamp was manually altered before it was submitted as evidence. He pressed another key, highlighting a specific line of code. Someone changed the time to frame Marcus Carter. Someone made sure that he looked guilty. The room was dead silent. Hamilton's fingers curled around his gavel, his jaw tightening. Jaden let the weight of his words settle before delivering the final blow. And the person who did it was Mitchell Graves. A gasp rippled through the courtroom. All eyes snapped to Graves. For the first time, the prosecutor froze. His face paled. His fingers twitched against the desk, as if physically restraining himself from reacting. Hamilton's stare was sharp enough to pierce steel. Mr. Cole, do you have any proof of this accusation? Jaden didn't blink. Yes, Your Honor. He turned back to the screen, opening another set of files. This is a forensic trace of the digital fingerprints left behind during the alteration of the footage. Every time a file is modified, it leaves behind an edit history An invisible trail. He highlighted another line of data. And here under the access logs, you'll see the user credentials tied to the last modification. He enlarged the screen. User ID m.graves_ADA. The courtroom erupted. Reporters scrambled for their phones. A juror leaned forward in their seat, eyes wide. A buzz of frantic whispers spread like wildfire. Hamilton's face darkened. "Order! Order!" The judge slammed his gavel, but the noise didn't stop. Mitchell Graves shot to his feet. "This is a baseless accusation." His voice was sharp, but beneath it, beneath the forced confidence, there was panic. Jaden tilted his head. "Then you won't mind explaining why your login credentials were used to tamper with key evidence in a federal case?" Graves's mouth opened, closed, his jaw clenched. Hamilton's gaze locked onto him. "Mr. Graves," the judge's voice was colder now, the arrogance gone. "Do you have an explanation for this?" Graves's lips pressed into a tight line. "Your Honor, this is nothing more than a last-minute stunt by a desperate defendant." Jaden cut him off. "Then let's check the court's official records, shall we?" He turned back to his laptop. Blind Justice already scanned the system, and guess what? The original, unedited footage is still stored on a secure state archive. He tapped a key. "We can pull it up right now. If the timestamp in that file doesn't match the one you submitted into evidence, then, well, I think we all know what that means." The silence that followed was suffocating. For the first time, Graves looked trapped. Hamilton's fingers curled tighter around his gavel. The judge wasn't an idiot. He had spent decades overseeing cases, controlling verdicts, and now he had lost control. Because the moment that file was pulled up, the moment it showed the real timestamp, the entire trial would collapse. And worse, so would Graves. Jaden didn't smile, didn't gloat. He just watched as the real power in the room shifted. For the first time since this trial had begun, the system wasn't in control. He was. The courtroom was teetering on the edge of chaos. Jaden had just shattered the prosecution's case, exposed Mitchell Graves as a fraud, and for the first time, the suffocating grip of injustice had begun to slip. Reporters whispered in frantic tones, camera shutters clicked furiously, and the jury shifted, their carefully maintained indifference cracking. Judge Hamilton's knuckles were white against the gavel, his jaw clenched so tightly it looked like it might snap. But before he could regain control, before Jaden could push further, drive the final nail into the system's coffin, the doors at the back of the courtroom slammed open. Two men in dark suits strode in, cutting through the tension like a blade through flesh. Their movements were precise, their expressions unreadable. The room, which had been a frenzy of noise seconds before, fell into an eerie silence. Jaden's stomach dropped. The lead agent, a man with a square jaw and the kind of presence that silenced rooms without a word, held up a badge. His voice was sharp, unyielding. "Jaden Cole, you are under arrest for unauthorized access to government databases and violations of federal cybersecurity laws." For a second, no one moved. Then the weight of the words settled over the courtroom like a bomb. Gasps erupted from the jury box. Reporters scrambled to adjust their microphones, their cameras. Hamilton's expression flickered. Relief, satisfaction, a silent understanding that the system always wins in the end. Jaden barely had time to process what was happening before the second agent stepped forward, reaching for him. Instinct kicked in. His chair scraped against the floor as he shot up. "Wait!" His voice was steady, but his pulse was a war drum in his ears. "I just proved I was framed, and now you're arresting me?" The lead agent didn't blink. "You illegally accessed classified judicial records and breached federal security systems. That is a direct violation of the Computer Fraud and Abuse Act." Jaden scoffed. "So let me get this straight. I expose a prosecutor for fabricating evidence, and instead of investigating him, you come for me?" His voice echoed through the chamber, but no one answered. Because the answer was obvious. They weren't here for justice. They were here to erase him. Mitchell Graves, who had just minutes ago been unraveling under Jaden's attack, suddenly straightened. His lips curled into a small, knowing smirk. A man who had just been moments away from losing everything was now watching as the problem was taken care of for him. Judge Hamilton cleared his throat, adjusting his robe as if he hadn't just been seconds away from losing control of his own courtroom. "It seems, Mr. Cole, that the law has finally caught up to you." Jaden felt it. The shift in the air. The way the courtroom's momentum had been stolen from him in an instant. He had been so close. And then they had pulled the rug out from under him. The second agent reached for his wrist. "Don't!" Jaden's voice wasn't loud, but it was sharp enough to freeze the man mid-motion. His mind raced, searching for an escape. A move that wouldn't end with him being dragged away in front of every camera in the room. He turned back toward the judge, toward the jury, toward the crowd watching history unfold. "You all see what's happening, right?" His gaze swept across them. "I just proved that Marcus Carter was framed. I just showed you the evidence that the prosecution manipulated this entire case. And instead of holding them accountable, they're trying to make me disappear." His words landed like stones thrown into a still lake, rippling through the room. Some of the jurors avoided his gaze. Others looked uncertain, but no one spoke up, because that was how it worked. They all knew. They just wouldn't say it. "The real crime," Jaden continued, his voice stronger now, "is that the system wasn't designed for people like me to win." The lead agent sighed. "Mr. Cole, if you don't come willingly, we'll be forced to remove you from the premises." There it was, the final warning. Jaden glanced at his mother. Lisa Cole stood in the front row, hands clasped together so tightly her knuckles had turned white. Her lips trembled, her eyes wide, filled with a terror she had carried all her life. A mother's terror, knowing that no matter how hard she fought, no matter how much she sacrificed, the world would always see her son as a threat. Her eyes met his, and he understood what she was silently begging him to do. Don't fight them. Because she knew what happened when black boys fought back. Jaden's throat tightened. The second agent grabbed his wrist. The cold, unforgiving bite of metal snapped shut around his skin. The first flash from a camera went off, then another, and another. Reporters shouted questions, their voices overlapping in a chaotic symphony. "Jaden, do you deny the charges? Jaden, what were you really doing with the government files? Do you have anything to say for yourself?" Jaden clenched his jaw, forcing himself to breathe. This wasn't over. They thought they had won, that by taking him away in cuffs, they had ended this, that they had buried the truth beneath a new, more convenient lie. But they didn't understand something fundamental. Jaden Cole wasn't just a hacker, he was a survivor, and survivors didn't go down without a fight. As the agents dragged him toward the exit, he lifted his chin, turned back toward the cameras, toward the world watching his story being rewritten in real time, and he made them a promise. "You can arrest me." His voice cut through the noise, sharp and clear. "But you can't erase the truth." Hamilton's gavel slammed down. The doors swung open, and Jaden Cole stepped into the unknown. The SUV sped through the empty streets, the hum of the engine steady, the city lights fading into the distance. Jaden Cole sat in the back, wrists locked in steel, the cold metal digging into his skin. The agents flanking him didn't speak, didn't acknowledge him as anything more than cargo being transported. He wasn't a defendant. He wasn't a whistleblower. He was a loose end that needed to be erased. This wasn't about guilt or innocence anymore. That had stopped mattering the moment he exposed the truth. The system had shifted gears, no longer interested in convicting him, only in making sure that he disappeared. Jaden turned his head slightly, catching a glimpse of the city through the window. Somewhere out there, his name was already being rewritten. On every screen, in every newsroom, the lie was spreading. Breaking news! Jaden Cole, a national threat? Sources confirm the teen hacker accessed restricted federal systems, potentially endangering national security. How dangerous was he? Experts warn of the growing cyber-terrorism threat. Jaden clenched his fists. They were turning him into a monster. The footage of his arrest played on repeat, agents dragging him away, his mother screaming his name. But they didn't show the truth. They didn't show Graves caught in a lie. They didn't show the falsified evidence Jaden had uncovered. Number. They only showed what they wanted the world to see. A 16-year-old black kid in handcuffs. A villain, manufactured in real time. The world wouldn't question it. They wouldn't ask why a government terrified of scrutiny had suddenly made him its greatest enemy. The system had done this before, to others who had dared to challenge it. Jaden was just the next name on the list. The SUV veered off the main road, heading toward something darker, something meant to swallow him whole. The agents beside him didn't check their phones, didn't need confirmation. They already knew. By the time they arrived, Jaden Cole would be forgotten. But as the road stretched ahead, Jaden's heartbeat slowed. They thought they had won. They thought erasing him was as easy as rewriting the headlines. But Jaden Cole wasn't just a hacker. He was a survivor. And before this was over, the world was going to know the truth. But the system had made one fatal mistake. It underestimated the power of the truth. They thought that by silencing Jaden, they could bury the evidence forever. What they didn't realize was that the truth had already escaped. And once it was out, there was no stopping it. The system thought it had buried Jaden Cole. They had dragged him away in handcuffs, erased his name from the courtroom, and rewritten his story into a national security threat. They had turned the press against him, flooding the airwaves with carefully curated lies, painting him as a dangerous hacker, a radical, a problem that needed to be removed. But they had made one fatal mistake. They had done it in front of the cameras. The footage hit the internet in fragments at first. Grainy recordings taken from inside the courtroom, blurry cell phone videos capturing Jaden's last words before the FBI stormed in. Then came the real bombshell, a high-definition leak of the trial itself. Someone had recorded everything. The world watched. They saw Jaden proving the prosecution had fabricated evidence. They saw Mitchell Graves go pale, his arrogance collapsing under the weight of Jaden's revelations. They saw Judge Hamilton gripping his gavel too tightly, his authority slipping away. And then they saw the moment it all fell apart. They saw the doors burst open. They saw the federal agents storm in like an execution squad. They saw Jaden's mother screaming, saw her fighting against the officers, saw the way Jaden barely had time to react before the handcuffs were on his wrists. They saw the press scrambling, the jury looking away, the way no one stopped it. And then they asked the one question the system had tried so hard to bury. If Jaden Cole was guilty, why were they so afraid to let him speak? The fire ignited instantly. Justice for Jaden. Expose. The system. Blind justice. The hashtags spread like wildfire. Within hours, the world was watching, and then the hackers came. It started on the deep web, whispers, encrypted messages, anonymous users mobilizing. Then one by one, major government databases began to bleed. Court records leaked, private emails exposed, a history of corruption, case tampering, buried evidence. Not just in Jaden's case, but in hundreds of others. Names surfaced: Mitchell Graves, Judge Hamilton, senior law enforcement officials, high-ranking government figures. They weren't just guilty of framing one black teenager. They had built careers on destroying lives. The press could no longer ignore it. The narrative they had been fed began to unravel. Reporters started asking questions they weren't supposed to ask. Why was Jaden Cole taken so aggressively? If he was a criminal, why was the trial never completed? Why do the leaked records show a pattern of fabricated evidence in multiple cases? The system panicked. Government officials scrambled to contain the damage. Press releases flooded the news, desperate attempts to shift the focus, to regain control. We are conducting an internal investigation into these allegations. The accusations against Mr. Graves and Judge Hamilton are being taken very seriously. We urge the public to trust the legal process. But no one trusted them anymore. Protesters flooded the streets, standing outside courthouses, police stations, demanding justice. Civil rights organizations issued statements. High-profile activists spoke out. Celebrities, politicians, people who would have never cared before, were now forced to pick a side. The pressure mounted. The system had tried to erase Jaden Cole. Instead, they had made him a symbol. And now, with the world watching, the system was running out of places to hide. The system had spent years building its walls, reinforcing its power, ensuring that no one, not the innocent, not the wrongfully convicted, not even a brilliant 16-year-old kid, could ever break through. But it had never accounted for what would happen when the whole world started watching. And now, under the weight of its own corruption, the walls were finally collapsing. The first to fall was Judge Richard Hamilton, the man who had ruled his courtroom like a king, who had smirked down at Jaden Cole as if his fate had already been written, was suspended indefinitely. It started as a quiet announcement buried in the middle of the news cycle, a single headline: Judge under review for potential judicial misconduct. But the system's attempt to downplay the scandal failed spectacularly. The leaked court records, the undeniable proof of his biased rulings, his history of over-sentencing black defendants, and his close ties to the prosecution, it all came crashing down on him like an avalanche. Protesters flooded the courthouse steps. Activists demanded his removal. The Judicial Ethics Commission had no choice but to open a full-scale investigation. And within days, Hamilton was gone. Suspended, stripped of power. A man who had once controlled the fate of thousands was now at the mercy of the very system he had manipulated for years. But the people weren't satisfied, because he wasn't the only one responsible. Next came Mitchell Graves. The assistant district attorney had spent his career fabricating evidence, burying exculpatory proof, twisting the law to serve his ambition. He had been untouchable until now. The hacker leaks had exposed everything: emails, phone transcripts, secret meetings. The media had once blindly repeated his lies, but now they wanted blood. A warrant was issued. The FBI, the same agency that had dragged Jaden Cole away like a criminal, was now investigating Graves for prosecutorial misconduct, evidence tampering, and obstruction of justice. He tried to run, tried to disappear before the consequences caught up to him. But the world wasn't looking away this time. News helicopters followed him as he left his office for the last time, his face pale, his arrogance shattered. Cameras swarmed him as reporters fired off questions he had no answers for. "Mr. Graves, do you deny the allegations? What do you say to the people whose lives you destroyed? Will you cooperate with the investigation?" No more smirks, no more control. He shoved past them, climbed into a waiting car, and slammed the door shut. But it was over. Hamilton had fallen. Graves had fallen. And now, finally, Marcus Carter was going home. The announcement came early that morning, his conviction overturned, his record wiped clean. He had spent 6 years behind bars for a crime he didn't commit. 6 years of stolen time. 6 years of waiting for a system that had never cared about him to finally admit it was wrong. The cameras were there when he walked out of Fulton County Correctional Facility, dressed in the same clothes he had worn the night he was arrested. The weight of injustice still clung to him, but his head was high, his eyes clear. The press shouted his name, but Marcus Carter wasn't looking at them. He was looking at the person who had fought for him, Jaden Cole, standing just outside the prison gates, free but still carrying the scars of a battle that wasn't over yet. Their eyes met, and in that moment, the system's worst nightmare came true. Because they had tried to erase Jaden Cole. Instead, they had created a movement. Thank you for watching until this moment and for standing with us on this journey for justice. Your support means everything. Like, subscribe, and turn on notifications so you never miss what's next. And we'd love to hear your thoughts. Leave a comment below and let us know what moved you most in this story. Together, our voices make a difference. In the weeks following Marcus Carter's release, in the spectacular fall of Judge Hamilton and Mitchell Graves, Jaden Cole's life transformed into something he had never imagined. Overnight, he was no longer simply the quiet, misunderstood teenager who had spent endless hours buried behind the screen of his computer, struggling to navigate a world that refused to understand him. Instead, he had become a symbol, an embodiment of courage, resilience, and justice. Everywhere he went, people recognized his face, whispering his name with a mixture of awe and reverence. Reporters clamored for interviews, desperately eager to understand how a 16-year-old had managed to topple one of the most corrupt judicial structures in the state. Tech companies reached out, offering scholarships and internships, eager to claim the young prodigy whose brilliance had uncovered truths that powerful people had tried desperately to bury. Social media was flooded with hashtags bearing his name. Images of his calm, determined expression during his arrest shared millions of times as a rallying cry against injustice and corruption. Jaden Cole, the teenage genius who defied the system, newspapers declared boldly. The boy who revealed corruption at its deepest roots, anchors repeated nightly. But the praise didn't change the scars Jaden carried inside. The memories of being cuffed, silenced, and dragged away in front of his mother. Of being branded a criminal by the very system that was meant to protect him. His heart still quickened painfully when he passed police cars parked along the street. His fist tightened instinctively when he heard sirens nearby. Beneath the surface, he knew the fight wasn't truly over. Not everyone celebrated his newfound fame. There were those who watched from the shadows, faces in the crowd who regarded him with suspicion, resentment, or something far darker. Online forums simmered with anonymous threats, angry voices declaring him dangerous, branding him a hacker who had endangered national security. To these hidden voices, Jaden was no hero. He was an enemy, someone who had exposed truths they wanted to remain buried. He could sense their anger, feel it in the anonymous emails flooding his inbox and the silent phone calls that left no messages, only quiet breathing before abruptly disconnecting. Yet despite these subtle threats, he refused to retreat. Jaden had always known the cost of revealing the truth. He knew that powerful enemies lurked in the background, waiting for their moment to strike again. But he refused to let fear control him. After everything he had endured, he understood that courage was not the absence of fear, but the determination to continue fighting in spite of it. He held tightly to that belief, moving forward each day with his head high, determined to stand as proof that one voice, no matter how quiet, could indeed spark a revolution. One evening, after yet another exhausting round of interviews, Jaden returned home, the familiar quiet of his modest apartment offering comfort after a day spent under glaring studio lights. He dropped onto the worn sofa, closing his eyes, briefly allowing himself a moment of peace. He barely had time to exhale when his phone vibrated insistently in his pocket. Pulling it out, he saw the screen flash with a notification, an unknown number calling at an odd hour. A chill crawled slowly down his spine, but he refused to succumb to fear. With a steadying breath, he answered, "Hello?" For a long moment, there was silence. Then slowly came a voice, deep, calm, with an icy edge that made his blood turn cold. "You think you've won, don't you, Jaden Cole?" Jaden tensed, his fingers gripping the phone tighter. He recognized the tone immediately. Someone powerful, someone used to being in control, someone not used to defeat. The voice held a clear threat behind each word, carefully measured to shake him. "You think that just because you brought down Hamilton and Graves, because you freed Marcus Carter, you've beaten us." The voice paused, the silence heavy and suffocating. "But you have no idea who you're up against. You have no idea how far this goes." Jaden's voice was firm, despite the unease growing in the pit of his stomach. "I know enough. I know corruption when I see it, and I won't stop fighting until the world sees it too." A cold, dark laugh echoed softly from the other end, dripping with scorn. Brave words for a boy who barely survived the first round. "Do you honestly think this was about one corrupt judge and one ambitious prosecutor? They were pawns, pieces we could afford to lose. There are more of us than you could possibly imagine, hidden behind titles, offices, badges, and robes. Do you think the world is truly ready to confront how deep our roots go?" Jaden stood up slowly, walking toward the window, his eyes scanning the quiet street outside. Darkness had descended, casting long, ominous shadows under the dim street lamps. The voice on the phone continued, colder now, more sinister. "You've stepped into a war you cannot possibly win, Jaden. Heroes are easily created, and even more easily destroyed. Remember that." Before Jaden could respond, the line disconnected abruptly, leaving him standing in silence. His heart pounded painfully in his chest, every muscle in his body tense. The caller had left no trace, no name, no number, just a stark warning hanging heavy in the air. He stared out at the street again, now filled with uncertainty and unease. Yet beneath the apprehension, beneath the cold rush of fear, something else stirred. Something stronger, something unbreakable. Determination, resolve, defiance. He had faced injustice, lies, and manipulation head-on and survived. They had already tried to silence him, tried to bury him, Yet he was still standing. He wouldn't let threats, anonymous or not, break him now. But he knew with absolute certainty that the voice hadn't been bluffing. Hamilton and Graves had been merely the tip of an iceberg, easily discarded pawns, sacrificed to protect a deeper, darker conspiracy. He understood now that this wasn't over. Not even close. The fight for true justice had only just begun, and he had unknowingly stepped into something far bigger, far more dangerous than he had imagined. Turning away from the window, Jaden moved purposefully back into the room, feeling the weight of responsibility settle firmly onto his shoulders. He wouldn't back down. He couldn't. Not after everything he had already endured. The truth mattered. He mattered. And no matter how many hidden enemies waited to strike from the shadows, no matter how many powerful figures tried to destroy him, Jaden would stand and fight. This story was far from finished. As the shadows stretched further into the quiet streets, Jaden knew with perfect clarity that this was just the beginning of something much greater. They had tried to erase him, silence him, and terrify him into submission. But instead they had forged him into something stronger, a symbol, an inspiration, a rallying cry for justice. Jaden took a deep breath, steadied his nerves, and embraced the path ahead. The battle lines had been drawn, and the next move was his. If you believe the truth deserves to be protected, hit like and subscribe right now. This isn't just a simple click. It's a powerful statement that justice may be delayed, but it can never be silenced. Jaden Cole's story isn't just about a teenage genius who challenged a corrupt system. It's about the courage of an ordinary person standing up against extraordinary injustice. It's about fighting prejudice, oppression, and abuse of power, even when the odds seem impossible. By sharing this video, you're ensuring that his voice and countless others like his will not be erased. Every time you share this story, you hold powerful people accountable. You amplify the voices of those still trapped in silence, giving them the strength to fight back and seek justice. Your one action today could inspire hope in someone who desperately needs it, reminding them that they are not alone and their fight is worth it. Let Jaden's journey be a reminder that no matter how long justice takes, truth will always rise above the lies. Corruption and injustice thrive only in silence. So let's break that silence together. Take action today. Hit like, subscribe, and share the story widely. Because when enough voices unite, we can change the world. Judge frames innocent black woman. But one call to her son, the U.S. Attorney General, ruins him. The sun hung low in the sky. Jessica Carter walked with slow but steady steps, her worn sandals tapping against the cracked pavement. Today was just another day, a simple trip to the store for milk and bread. She reached Mike's Market, a small grocery store tucked between the towering glass buildings that now defined the neighborhood. The bell above the door chimed softly as she entered, a welcome contrast to the noise of the street outside. Milk first, then bread, then home. Jessica reached for the milk, her fingers grazing the cool condensation of the carton when something caught her eye. A flicker of motion in the corner of her vision, a young man, hoodie pulled low over his face, moving fast. Too fast. Her breath hitched as she turned slightly, watching as his hands darted across the shelves with practiced ease, stuffing energy bars and snacks into his pockets without hesitation. Every muscle in his body was wound tight, his movements sharp and calculated. A heartbeat later, the alarm blared. The sharp mechanical shriek shattered the quiet, sending a jolt through the store. Jessica turned just as the thief bolted, shoving open the glass door with his shoulder and disappearing onto the street. The bell chimed again, a cruel echo of his escape. Silence followed. Then, "Hey! Stop right there!" The voice was sharp, commanding. Jessica flinched. She turned her head, expecting to see someone, anyone running after the thief. But no one moved. No one chased him. Instead, a man in a navy polo, broad-shouldered, his badge clipped to his belt, was striding toward her, an off-duty cop. His eyes locked onto hers, sharp and unwavering. Jessica's stomach twisted. "You!" he barked. "Hands where I can see them." Jessica's breath caught in her throat. "I what?" The officer was already closing in, his movements precise, his focus absolute. Hands, now. I don't understand. Her voice wavered, but she forced herself to meet his gaze. I haven't done anything. You think you're slick? His tone was flat, certain, as if the decision had already been made. Empty your pockets. Jessica blinked. My pockets? Her fingers tightened around the plastic handle of her shopping basket, still hooked over her arm, the carton of milk resting inside. She turned toward the counter, toward Mike the owner, the man she had known for years. Mike, she called, her voice edged with urgency. Tell him! You saw I didn't take anything. Mike stood behind the register, his gaze flicking between her and the officer. A flicker of hesitation crossed his face. He knew. He had seen. But then his expression hardened. His shoulders stiffened. His eyes dropped to the counter. He said nothing. Jessica's breath stilled. Mike, she whispered, her voice cracking. Please. The betrayal landed like a punch to the gut. Come with me, the officer ordered, his grip closing around her frail wrist. Jessica recoiled. No, I haven't done anything wrong. A few customers turned their heads now, some whispering, some raising their phones. But no one stepped forward. No one intervened. The officer didn't wait for her compliance. He spun her around in one swift motion, forcing her arms behind her back. Jessica gasped. Click. Jessica's breath came in shallow gasps as the cold metal of the handcuffs bit into her thin wrists. The officer's grip on her arm was firm, unyielding, his fingers digging into her skin as if she were a dangerous criminal. But she wasn't. She was a 70-year-old woman who had come to buy milk and bread. Yet here she stood, restrained like a common thief, the weight of the accusation pressing against her chest, suffocating. Her heart pounded in her ears, her body trembling not from fear, but from the sheer, unbearable injustice of it all. Her eyes darted toward Mike, the store's owner, a man she had known for years, a man who had once greeted her with warmth and familiarity. He stood behind the counter, his face a mask of uneasy silence. He had seen it all. He had watched the real thief run. He knew she was innocent. And yet, when the officer's accusing eyes flickered toward him, searching for confirmation, Mike hesitated. Jessica saw the moment his loyalty fractured, saw the fear creep into his expression. Mike, she pleaded, her voice raw, desperate. Tell him, you know I didn't do anything. Mike swallowed, his Adam's apple bobbing, his gaze shifting to the floor. His fingers tapped against the register, a nervous rhythm, a silent battle waging within him. He could stop this. A single sentence, a nod, anything. But instead he cleared his throat and muttered, I didn't see. The words sliced through Jessica like a blade. You didn't see? Her voice cracked, disbelieving. Mike, you... The officer yanked her arm, cutting her off, his grip tightening like a vice. That's enough, he snapped, his patience thinning. Jessica twisted, struggling to make eye contact with the people around her. The other customers, men and women who had walked these aisles beside her for years, stood frozen, their expressions unreadable. Some held their phones. Cameras pointed at her like spectators at an execution. Others whispered, their words hushed, their gazes flicking toward the exit, toward anywhere but her. Someone say something, she begged, her voice rising, sharp with urgency. You all saw he ran right past me? Silence. A woman near the produce section clutched her purse tighter. A man by the refrigerated aisle shuffled his feet, shifting uncomfortably. No one spoke. No one moved. Jessica felt the crushing weight of it, the suffocating betrayal of a community she had spent a lifetime believing in. These were the same people who had once greeted her with smiles, who had once waved as she passed by, the same people whose children she had taught, whose families she had watched grow. And now, when she needed them, when the truth was plain as day, they stood by and watched. The betrayal burned hotter than the humiliation. The officer jerked her forward, dragging her toward the exit. Jessica stumbled, her knees nearly buckling, but he didn't slow. The weight of the stairs bore down on her, pressing against her ribs like a vice. The glass doors loomed ahead, and beyond them, the world continued as if nothing was happening. Outside, the sun still shone. Cars still passed. People still walked the sidewalks, oblivious. Somewhere down the street, the real thief had melted into the city, free, Forgotten. Jessica Carter, 70 years old, was marched out in handcuffs, her dignity stripped away in the space of a heartbeat, and not a single soul had stood for her. And then, the cold iron doors slammed shut behind her. Jessica flinched at the harsh clang, the finality of it sending a shiver down her spine. The officer who had marched her in barely spared her a glance before walking away, leaving her standing there, wrists aching, dignity in shambles. The air was thick, stagnant, pressing down on her like a weight she couldn't shake. She took a slow step forward, her gaze sweeping across the dimly lit holding cell, the cracked concrete walls, the rusted metal bench bolted to the floor. The air in the holding cell was thick, stale, carrying the acrid scent of sweat, damp concrete, and something metallic blood perhaps, or just the lingering ghosts of too many lives passing through. Forgotten. The dim overhead bulb flickered intermittently, casting jagged shadows along the cracked walls. Jessica Carter sat stiffly on the cold metal bench, her hands resting limply in her lap, her wrists still aching from the too tight handcuffs that had only recently been removed. Her breath came slow, measured, but her heart pounded furiously against her ribs, a rhythmic reminder of the nightmare she had been thrust into. 70 years of life, of dignity, reduced to this. A caged animal. The walls of the cell felt too close, pressing inward, suffocating. The concrete was damp beneath her fingertips as she steadied herself, her legs weak from exhaustion and the lingering tremors of disbelief. She wanted to tell herself this was temporary, a mistake that would soon be rectified. But as she sat in the dim, suffocating silence, reality settled over her like a heavy weight. The system did not rush to correct its mistakes, especially not for people like her. A rustle of movement caught her attention. Across from her, in the same miserable cage, a younger woman sat curled against the wall, her arms wrapped tightly around herself. Her clothes were cheap, worn thin at the elbows, her sneakers scuffed and coming apart at the seams. Her face, partially obscured by a mass of tangled curls, held an exhaustion that ran deeper than just this night. It was the kind of exhaustion that only came from years of struggle, of always being on the losing side of a war you never asked to fight. Jessica met her eyes, and for a moment, neither spoke. Then the woman let out a bitter laugh, shaking her head. "What did they get you for?" Jessica hesitated. How did she even begin to explain the absurdity of it? That she had walked into a store for milk and bread and walked out in handcuffs? That a lifetime of abiding by the rules had amounted to nothing the moment an officer decided she looked guilty? She exhaled, steadying her voice. "They think I stole." The woman snorted. "Yeah, welcome to the club." She shifted slightly, stretching out her legs. "I took a granola bar for my little girl." A hollow chuckle escaped her lips. "Didn't have enough for it. Thought I could just slip it in my pocket. Didn't think they'd actually arrest me for it." Jessica felt something tighten in her chest. A granola bar. Not jewelry, not money, not something sold for profit. Just a single, meager snack. "For your daughter," Jessica murmured, as if saying it aloud made it even more unreal. The woman nodded, her gaze flickering downward. She was hungry. A silence settled between them, heavy and unspoken. Jessica stared at the peeling paint on the opposite wall, the grime-streaked floor beneath her feet. How many women had sat in this very spot? How many had been locked away for crimes as small, as desperate as this? She thought of the boy in the hoodie, his swift hands, his practiced escape. He had been the one who stole, but he had run free while she, an elderly woman who had done nothing, had been thrown into this cage. She thought of the officer's grip on her arm, the cold snap of the handcuffs, the way the store owner had looked away. Her entire life she had believed in justice. She had taught it in her classrooms, had instilled it in her son. She had held on to the belief that if one worked hard, did right by others, stayed in their lane, justice would stand by them. But justice had not stood by her today. She turned back to the woman across from her, searching for something understanding, perhaps, or simply someone to share the weight of this realization with. "What happens now?" she asked quietly. The woman exhaled sharply. "Now?" She leaned her head back against the cold stone wall. "Now we wait. Till they decide if we're worth letting go, or if we're just another case to process. Jessica swallowed hard. Another case, another file, just numbers to be pushed through the system, unimportant beyond the ink on the paperwork. She thought of Jamal, her son, his voice always so strong, so certain, echoing through the halls of power, demanding justice. She had spent her life proud of him, believing he was part of something good, something right. But if justice truly existed, why was she here? Why was this woman across from her here? Why had no one stopped it? Yet even as the doubt swirled, even as the weight of betrayal threatened to crush her, something deep within her refused to let go entirely. She straightened her spine. "Someone will come," she murmured, half to herself, half to the woman in front of her. The woman huffed a humorless laugh. "You sure about that?" Jessica wanted to be. She had to be. The holding cell door swung open with a heavy creak, and an officer's voice rang out, sharp and detached. "Carter, court's in session." Jessica lifted her head, exhaustion pressing against her bones like lead. The night had been long, the air in the cell thick with the stench of mildew and despair. She had barely slept, her mind replaying the moment over and over, the cold steel of the handcuffs, the averted gazes, the overwhelming silence of those who could have spoken for her, but chose not to. Now, as she was led down the dimly lit hallway toward the courtroom, her heart pounded with a fragile, desperate hope. Maybe this was the moment reason would prevail. Maybe, just maybe, someone would listen. But as she stepped through the heavy double doors and into the sterile glow of the courtroom, one look at the judge's impassive face and the prosecutor's quiet smirk told her everything she needed to know. This was not about justice. This was about going through the motions, and the verdict had already been decided. The courtroom was sterile, devoid of warmth or humanity, its cold fluorescent lights casting a harsh glare over the polished wooden benches and the imposing judge's bench at the front. Jessica sat at the defendant's table, her fingers curling tightly around the armrest of the chair, her back straight despite the exhaustion weighing her down. She had barely slept in the holding cell, and the past 24 hours had blurred into a haze of indignity and disbelief. Now she was here, in a place where truth was supposed to matter, where justice was supposed to be blind. But as she looked around the room, she knew. Justice was only blind when it wanted to be. The bailiff called the court to order, his voice echoing through the chamber, and the man who would decide her fate entered. Judge Thomas Mercer. An older white man with sharp blue eyes and a stiff posture, the embodiment of rigid conservatism. He barely spared Jessica a glance as he took his seat, flipping through a file that, Jessica suspected, had already determined her guilt long before she even walked through those doors. The prosecutor, a younger man in a perfectly pressed gray suit, stood first. His confidence was palpable, his voice smooth, rehearsed. "Your Honor," he began, adjusting his tie as he addressed the court. The defendant was found at the scene of the crime. The arresting officer witnessed her standing at the exact location where the theft occurred. Given her proximity and the lack of any other suspects present at the time, we have every reason to believe that she is guilty of the charge against her. Jessica's hands clenched into fists beneath the table. This was how they did it, how they twisted reality, bent the truth to fit their narrative. She wasn't found at the scene of the crime. She had been shopping. She had been choosing a carton of milk while the real thief had bolted past her. Her lawyer, a man whose name she had only learned minutes before the trial began, finally shifted in his seat, flipping lazily through his papers as if he were searching for something, though it was clear he wasn't really looking. He hadn't asked her any real questions before the trial, hadn't seemed particularly interested in her side of the story, and now as the prosecution built its case against her, he sat there, silent, uninterested, playing the part of defense but doing nothing to actually defend her. Jessica swallowed hard. She was alone in this room. "Your Honor," the prosecutor continued, his tone smooth as glass. "Unfortunately, the security cameras in the store were malfunctioning that day. Therefore, we do not have direct footage of the theft occurring. However, given the circumstances, we believe the officer's report and the store owner's statement are more than enough to establish guilt." Jessica's breath caught in her throat. The cameras were malfunctioning? That was a lie. She had seen the cameras when she entered the store, their small red recording lights blinking steadily. She had pleaded for them to be checked when she was arrested, but no one had listened then, and now they had simply erased the only thing that could prove her innocence. Her lawyer cleared his throat, but instead of objecting, instead of challenging the claim, he only muttered, "Your Honor, I suppose we'd like to verify that claim about the cameras, but—" He trailed off, flipping another page in his file, his expression disinterested. Jessica felt a sickening twist in her stomach. He wasn't going to fight for her. He wasn't going to demand that the footage be checked, wasn't going to challenge the store owner's silence, wasn't going to force the officer to answer for why he had arrested an elderly woman while the real thief had vanished into the streets. He was here to do the bare minimum, to shuffle papers, to let the machine of the system churn forward uninterrupted. Judge Mercer barely reacted to the weak request, his fingers tapping idly against the wooden bench as if he were already growing bored of the proceedings. "The cameras were malfunctioning," he repeated, his voice clipped, definitive. "There's nothing more to discuss on that matter." Nothing more to discuss. Jessica's pulse pounded. She could feel it slipping away, her innocence, her freedom, her dignity, all slipping through the cracks of a system that did not care, a system that had already decided she was guilty before she had even spoken a word. "Does the defense have anything further to add?" Mercer asked, turning his gaze toward her lawyer. For a moment, a terrible, heavy silence filled the room. Then her so-called defender sighed and leaned back in his chair. No, Your Honor," he muttered. "I think that about covers it." Jessica's mouth went dry. That was it? That was all? Her life, her reputation, everything reduced to a single half-hearted response? She wanted to scream, to stand up, to demand to be heard. But she knew it wouldn't matter. Not in this room. Not in front of these people. Judge Mercer gave a single nod, already moving forward. "Very well. Given the lack of substantial evidence to refute the charge and the corroborating testimony of the arresting officer and store owner, I am inclined to proceed." The prosecutor, victorious, gave a small smile. Jessica's lawyer simply adjusted his tie. Jessica sat frozen, her heart pounding against her ribs. She was going to lose. Not because she was guilty, not because there was any real proof against her, but because that was how this worked. Because for people like her, justice was not a right. It was a privilege, one that could be denied with a single ruling, a single lie, a single glance away from the truth. Judge Mercer straightened in his seat. "The court will reconvene shortly to discuss sentencing." She sat frozen as the bailiff motioned for her to rise, her body sluggish, her mind still racing to grasp what had just happened. The case against her had been built on air, yet it stood unshaken. Her lawyer had barely spoken. The so-called evidence was non-existent, and still the courtroom had swallowed her defense without a second thought. Now they would decide what price she had to pay for a crime she hadn't committed. Jessica's heart pounded as she was led from the defendant's table, her legs unsteady beneath her. The walls of the courthouse seemed to close in as she was escorted into a side chamber, a cramped waiting area that smelled faintly of stale coffee and ink-stained paperwork. She sat, her fingers gripping the edge of the chair, knowing the moment of reckoning was approaching. The judge would return. The prosecutor would make his final push, and the system that had already failed her would once again decide her fate. Then the doors opened, and the bailiff's voice rang out. "All rise, the court is back in session." Jessica inhaled sharply. It was time. The prosecutor straightened his tie before speaking. "Given the nature of the charges, the court recommends a bail amount of—" He barely paused, barely took a breath, before delivering the sentence that made Jessica's entire world tilt. $10,000. The words hit Jessica like a punch to the gut. $10,000. She blinked, barely processing the number, her mind struggling to keep up with the absurdity of what she had just heard. She had braced herself for something unreasonable, but this was beyond comprehension. Her fingers curled tightly around the edge of the defense table, her nails pressing into the worn wood. Her breath felt trapped in her chest as if the walls of the courtroom were closing in around her. $10,000? For what? For a crime she hadn't committed? For a carton of milk she had never stolen? Her lawyer, the man who had barely uttered more than a handful of words in her defense, shifted in his seat, clearing his throat. "Your Honor," he started, but even his tone was reluctant, lacking any true conviction. That amount seems excessive given the nature of the alleged crime. Alleged. Jessica turned her head slightly, studying his expression. There was no urgency in his voice, no fire in his words. He wasn't arguing, he was merely suggesting, as if this was nothing more than a slight inconvenience, rather than a life-altering sentence. The prosecutor, standing tall and poised, didn't even try to hide his smirk. Given the circumstances, we find this amount more than reasonable, he countered smoothly, his voice laced with false professionalism. There is no surveillance footage to verify her claims of innocence, and while the defendant has no prior record, she was found at the scene. We have no choice but to take precautionary measures to ensure her compliance with the legal process. Jessica's jaw clenched. No surveillance footage. Because it had mysteriously malfunctioned. Because the only proof that could exonerate her had conveniently disappeared. Because the people who had the power to correct this injustice had no interest in doing so. Her lawyer made a half-hearted attempt to push back. Your Honor, my client is 70 years old, a retired teacher. She poses no flight risk. Surely, denied, Judge Mercer interrupted before he could finish, his gavel striking down with finality. Jessica flinched. The decision had been made. There was no deliberation, no consideration, only the swift, brutal efficiency of a system designed to crush those who had no means to fight back. Her fingers trembled as they rested in her lap. $10,000. It might as well have been $1 million. Her entire Social Security check wouldn't even cover a fraction of it. She had a small savings, something she had tucked away over the years for emergencies, but it wasn't even close. The reality settled over her like a suffocating weight. She wasn't going home today. The bailiff moved toward her, his presence looming, ready to take her back to the holding cell. Let's go, he said, his tone void of emotion. Jessica's pulse pounded in her ears. She had spent her entire life believing in justice, in fairness, in the idea that the truth would always find a way. She had instilled those values in her students, had taught her son to believe in them, to fight for them, and now here she was, sitting in a courtroom where the truth had never even been considered. Her breath came out shaky, her voice barely above a whisper. I want to make a phone call. She had spent her entire life fighting her own battles, never asking for help unless absolutely necessary. But now in this cold, unfeeling courtroom, with the gavel's echo still ringing in her ears, she had no choice. She was out of options. The judge leaned back in his chair, arms crossed, a smirk tugging at the corner of his lips as he regarded her with thinly veiled amusement. A phone call? He mused, his voice dripping with mockery. You really think calling someone will change anything? What, are you hoping to plead your case over the phone? Prove your innocence to someone who actually cares? He chuckled dryly, shaking his head. Go ahead, Mrs. Carter, make your call, but don't expect it to do you any good. Jessica's jaw tightened, but she didn't respond. She wouldn't give him the satisfaction. She turned away, her eyes locking onto the payphone bolted to the wall. The bailiff beside her nudged her forward impatiently. 5 minutes, he muttered. Jessica lifted the receiver, her hands shaking as she dialed the only number that mattered. The line rang once, twice, and then, finally, hello? The voice on the other end was deep, commanding, and instantly familiar. Her breath hitched. For a moment, she couldn't speak. The strength she had tried so hard to maintain cracked, the damning weight of the last 24 hours pressing against her chest like a vice. Mama? His tone shifted immediately. Jessica squeezed her eyes shut, inhaled shakily, and whispered, Jamal, baby, I need you. A beat of silence. Then the sound of a chair scraping against a floor, papers rustling. What happened? His voice was sharper now, urgent, the mask of calm he had perfected over the years slipping away. Jessica forced herself to steady her voice, to push past the lump in her throat. They arrested me, she said, barely above a whisper. They're saying I stole something. I didn't, Jamal. I swear, I didn't. His breath came short and fast on the other end. Where are you? In court. They set my bail at $10,000. The words felt heavier now, more ridiculous. Jamal, I can't. You don't have to, he cut her off, his voice laced with barely contained fury. "I'm coming." Then the line went dead. Jessica let out a slow, shaky breath, lowering the receiver back into place. She turned, expecting to see the judge's smug expression, the bailiff's disinterest, the prosecutor's satisfaction. But none of them mattered anymore, because Jamal was coming. Across the city in a towering government building lined with marble and steel, Jamal Carter, the United States Attorney General, stood frozen behind his desk, his fingers still gripping the phone, his knuckles white. The weight of those 5 words, "Mama, I need you," ripped through him like a bullet. His mother was the strongest woman he had ever known. She never asked for help, never showed fear. If she was calling him like this, if her voice was shaking, it meant something was terribly wrong. He didn't ask questions. He didn't need to. He grabbed his jacket from the back of his chair and strode toward the door, his mind already racing. "Cancel my next meeting," he barked at his assistant. "Sir?" she asked, startled. "Now," he snapped, already halfway down the hall. He moved like a storm, his long strides unrelenting as he pulled out his phone and dialed a number. The line barely had time to ring before someone picked up. "This is Carter," he said, his voice sharp as steel. "I need every detail on an arrest made today at a local grocery store. A 70-year-old black woman accused of shoplifting. Find it, now." His driver was already waiting when he hit the pavement outside, the government-issued black SUV idling at the curb. He yanked open the door, sliding in as the vehicle peeled away from the curb, the city blurring past the tinted windows. Jamal's mind was a whirlwind. His mother sitting in a courtroom, being treated like a criminal. The thought sent a surge of rage through him, so intense it nearly made his vision blur. He had spent his career fighting for justice. He had stood at podiums, debated policies, rewritten laws to protect the innocent, to dismantle the systemic rot that had plagued their communities for generations. And yet, none of it had mattered. None of it had stopped this from happening. To her, his fingers curled into fists. He had sworn to uphold the law. Now, he would see if the law was prepared to face him. The courthouse loomed ahead, its stone facade cold and unmoving. But the moment he stepped inside, everything would change. The heavy wooden doors of the courtroom swung open with a force that sent a sharp creak echoing through the chamber. For a brief moment, nothing happened. The air remained thick with routine indifference, the judge flipping through paperwork, the prosecutor tapping his pen against the desk, the bailiff standing at ease. Jessica sat at the defendant's table, her shoulders heavy, her hands clasped together in quiet resignation. She had spent the last few hours suffocating under the weight of a system that had already decided her fate. And then the silence cracked, the sharp click of polished dress shoes against the marble floor. Deliberate, measured, unapologetically commanding. A ripple of awareness moved through the room, subtle at first, an involuntary shift of bodies, an instinctual straightening of backs. A murmur, barely audible, skittered across the gallery as heads turned toward the entrance. Jessica lifted her chin just as he stepped into view. Jamal Carter, not just any man, the United States Attorney General, the highest-ranking law enforcement officer in the country, a name that carried weight in every courtroom, a presence that turned the tide of cases before arguments were even spoken. And he was here. For her. The judge's fingers, once lazily drumming against the bench, froze mid-motion. The prosecutor, who had spent the entire hearing oozing confidence, stiffened, his jaw locking as he quickly exchanged a glance with the bailiff. Even the officer who had arrested Jessica, who had so easily thrown those handcuffs around her frail wrists, shifted uncomfortably, as if suddenly aware of just how badly he had miscalculated. Jamal did not stop at the threshold. He did not hesitate, did not slow. He walked with the kind of power that made space for itself, his suit crisp, his presence undeniable. The air shifted. A courtroom that had once felt suffocating, pressing in on Jessica, now bent in the opposite direction. Jamal's gaze swept across the room, sharp and dissecting, absorbing every face, every detail, before finally landing on his mother. The moment their eyes met, Jessica felt the tightness in her chest ease just slightly. He was here, but Jamal did not soften. His expression, chiseled from years of standing firm against corruption, remained hard, unreadable. He placed a hand on the back of Jessica's chair, a silent claim, a declaration to the room. This was his mother. This was not a case file. This was not just another defendant. And they had made a grave mistake. Judge Mercer cleared his throat, a forced attempt to reestablish control, though the beads of sweat forming at his temple betrayed him. He folded his hands together, adjusting his posture, as if recalibrating his authority. "Mr. Carter," he said, his voice measured but slightly strained, "this is unexpected." Jamal finally moved, straightening, his broad shoulders pulling back as he adjusted his cufflinks. A deliberate pause followed, the kind that forced a room to listen. Then he spoke. "Unexpected," he repeated, his voice smooth, lethal. "Yes, I imagine it is." The judge's lips pressed into a thin line. The prosecutor shifted again. The officer near the wall swallowed hard. Jamal exhaled through his nose, nodding slightly, as if he were piecing it together in real time. "You see, I was under the impression that the law was meant to serve justice. That due process was not a privilege, but a right." His eyes flickered toward the prosecutor. That evidence was required before a person could be criminalized. The prosecutor opened his mouth, but Jamal was not finished. He turned his gaze back to the judge, and for the first time it sharpened. "Imagine my surprise when I received a call informing me that my 70-year-old mother, who has no criminal record, no history of theft, and no reason to steal, was arrested, humiliated, and thrown into a holding cell. Over a carton of milk." The words landed. The judge's fingers twitched slightly. The gallery sat motionless, the weight of the moment thick and suffocating. Jamal let the silence linger before continuing, his voice quiet, controlled. "Imagine my further surprise," he said, "when I learned that the security cameras, which my mother specifically requested to be checked, were suddenly and conveniently malfunctioning." The prosecutor flinched. Jessica, watching all of this unfold, remained still, her hands trembling under the table. She had seen her son speak in front of press conferences. She had seen him on television, standing in front of the country, dissecting corruption, holding powerful men accountable. But she had never seen him like this. Not furious, not enraged, but something colder. Something that made even the most seasoned men in this room sweat beneath their perfectly tailored suits. Jamal took another step forward, his voice dipping lower, forcing them all to listen. "My mother," he said, enunciating every word, "is not some case to be swept under the rug. She is not some number in your system, and I guarantee you," he tilted his head slightly, his tone laced with absolute certainty, "this will not be ignored." A heavy pause. The prosecutor swallowed, fumbling with the papers in front of him. The officer near the wall shifted again, suddenly interested in his own shoes. Judge Mercer let out a slow breath through his nose, pressing his fingertips together in thought. Jessica could see at the shift. Moments ago, they had been in control. The judge, the prosecutor, the system itself. Now, they were scrambling because the person standing in front of them was not just an attorney, not just another suit in a courtroom. This was the United States Attorney General, and they had just wrongfully arrested his mother. Jessica exhaled. For the first time since this nightmare began, the weight pressing against her chest lifted. The fight for justice is just beginning. More shocking twists are ahead. Don't miss a moment. Like, subscribe, and turn on notifications to stay with us. Thank you for standing for truth and justice. Where are you watching from? Let us know. Jamal's voice sliced through the tense silence like a blade. I want to see the footage. The prosecutor stiffened. His fingers, which had been steadily flipping through case files, stilled for a fraction of a second before he composed himself. Slowly, he lifted his gaze, adjusting his tie with an air of forced nonchalance. "Mr. Carter," he began, his tone measured, careful. "As I mentioned earlier, the store's security system was experiencing technical issues at the time of the incident. Unfortunately, the footage is..." "Don't." Jamal's voice was low, firm, carrying the weight of a man who had heard every excuse imaginable. He took a step forward, his presence looming, radiating an authority that made everyone in the room instinctively straighten. His eyes locked onto the prosecutors with an intensity that left no room for misinterpretation. "I wasn't asking for a summary," he continued. "I wasn't asking for an explanation. I said, play the footage." The prosecutor hesitated, a bead of sweat forming at his temple. The courtroom, moments ago filled with quiet murmurs and rustling papers, now stood frozen in anticipation. Judge Mercer cleared his throat, his discomfort palpable. "Mr. Carter, I understand your concerns, but the prosecution has stated—" Jamal turned sharply, his gaze cutting to the judge. "With all due respect, Your Honor," he said, his voice even, but with a razor-sharp edge beneath it. "We're in a court of law, are we not? We don't rely on hearsay here. We rely on evidence. If there's footage, I want to see it." The prosecutor forced a tight-lipped smile, feigning patience. "Mr. Carter, as I said, the footage is unavailable. The store's cameras were malfunctioning that day." "Are you absolutely sure about that?" Jamal's question was deceptively calm, but something in his tone sent a flicker of doubt across the prosecutor's face. The room felt it. Jessica, sitting silently at the defense table, clenched her hands together, her pulse hammering against her ribs. She had spent the last 24 hours suffocating under the weight of injustice, watching the system crush her without a second thought. But now she wasn't alone. Now her son was here. And he wasn't just here to argue. He was here to dismantle the lie they had built against her. The prosecutor opened his mouth, ready to repeat the excuse he had rehearsed. But Jamal was already reaching into his suit pocket. A small device, sleek, black, and unassuming, sat in his palm. A flash drive. "I had a team look into the store's security system," he said, holding it up. "Turns out there was footage. The store's system has automatic cloud storage backups, which, interestingly enough, weren't checked by the prosecution. A bomb had just been dropped in the middle of the courtroom. The shift was immediate. A murmur rippled through the gallery, eyes widening, heads turning. The bailiff's posture tensed. The judge's fingers twitched against his gavel. And the prosecutor? His face went white. Jamal let the silence stretch, allowing the weight of his words to sink in before delivering the final blow. "So, once again," he said, stepping closer, his voice deadly quiet, "play the footage." For the first time since the trial began, the prosecutor looked genuinely rattled. His carefully maintained mask cracked, the confidence in his posture faltering. He turned slightly toward Judge Mercer, as if searching for an escape, but there was none. Everyone was watching. Everyone was waiting. Judge Mercer shifted uncomfortably, adjusting his glasses. He was a man who had spent decades in control of his courtroom, dictating the pace, ensuring that everything moved according to his authority. But at this moment, he wasn't in control. Jamal was. A beat of silence passed before the judge exhaled sharply, nodding toward the bailiff. "Play it." The prosecutor's jaw clenched. He knew he had lost. A screen was wheeled into the courtroom. The bailiff, his movements stiff with tension, inserted the flash drive into the display system. The screen flickered, then came to life. And then there it was. The truth. The screen flickered for a moment, then the footage began to play. The quality was grainy, the store's overhead fluorescent lights casting a cold, artificial glow over the aisles. The timestamp in the corner of the screen showed the exact moment of the incident. Jessica sat rigid, watching herself appear on the screen. There she was, a 70-year-old woman, moving slowly down the aisle, a small shopping basket hooked over her arm. She reached for a carton of milk, her movements deliberate, unhurried. The quiet mundanity of the moment felt surreal now, knowing what had followed. Then a shadow darted across the frame. A young man in a gray hoodie. He moved with sharp, practiced efficiency, his hands sweeping across the shelves, stuffing small items into his pockets in quick succession. His posture was tense, alert. A man who had done this before and knew exactly how to get away with it. The footage continued. The young man didn't hesitate, didn't second-guess his actions. He barely looked around before pivoting toward the exit, his pace shifting from cautious to hurried. Then the alarm. A sharp, mechanical screech filled the store. The thief jolted but didn't stop. He bolted, shoving open the glass door, vanishing into the street. Jessica, still holding the milk, turned her head at the sound, confused. She didn't move. She hadn't even noticed him. Then another figure entered the frame. The officer. He wasn't looking at the door. He didn't chase the real thief. Instead, he strode directly toward Jessica. The courtroom remained dead silent as the footage continued, showing exactly what had happened. Jessica flinching in confusion as the officer grabbed her arm, the shopping basket still dangling from her wrist, the way he twisted her around before she could even protest. Then the handcuffs. The moment she became a suspect, the video cut to static, and for the first time since the trial began, everyone in the room knew the truth. The truth had been there all along. She had screamed for it, begged for it, pleaded for them to check the footage, to just look. And yet, it had taken this, her son, the U.S. Attorney General, walking into the courtroom and forcing their hands to make them acknowledge it. The prosecutor sat rigid, his fingers clenched into fists, his carefully constructed case crumbling into dust before his eyes. He looked like he wanted to argue, to grasp for something, anything that could undo the damage. But there was nothing left to say. The evidence had spoken. Judge Mercer, his face unreadable, cleared his throat and removed his glasses, rubbing the bridge of his nose. It was the first real sign of hesitation the man had shown since this trial began. Jessica watched him carefully. He was a man who had made up his mind long before she had ever stepped into this room. A man who had seen her not as a person, but as a case file to be processed, an inconvenience to be removed. And now he had been backed into a corner. With measured movements, he adjusted his robe, sitting up straighter, trying to regain control of a courtroom that no longer belonged to him. His gaze swept over the prosecution, the defense, then finally settled on Jessica. For the first time, he really looked at her, not as an accused thief, not as a faceless defendant, but as a human being. Jessica felt no satisfaction in that realization. It had taken undeniable proof to force him to see her. Judge Mercer let out a slow breath before speaking, his voice steady but lacking its earlier sharpness. "The court has reviewed the evidence," he said, his words carefully chosen. "In light of the newly presented footage, it is clear that the defendant, a pause, slight but deliberate, was not responsible for the alleged crime." Another silence, one that stretched too long, too uncomfortable. Jessica knew what this was. A man wrestling with the weight of his own bias, with the knowledge that he had been prepared to condemn an innocent woman without hesitation. Then finally, the charges against Jessica Carter are hereby dismissed. A low murmur rippled through the courtroom, like an exhale no one had realized they'd been holding. A gavel strike followed, final and absolute. It was over. Jessica closed her eyes for a moment, letting the words settle. But the relief she expected never came. There was no joy in this victory, because it wasn't a victory. Her hands remained clenched together in her lap. If Jamal hadn't walked through that door, if he hadn't demanded the footage, would this courtroom have ever given her justice? She already knew the answer. The judge had not been on her side. The prosecutor had not been interested in truth. The officer who had arrested her had been eager to throw her in a cell without so much as a second thought. And the worst part? No one in this room was truly sorry. They were embarrassed, they were uncomfortable, but they were not sorry. Jessica slowly rose to her feet as Jamal stepped toward her. His presence was still towering, still commanding, but there was something else in his eyes now, something softer, something deeply unsettled. He had spent his life defending the law, believing in the system, fighting for justice within its walls. But today he had seen firsthand just how easily it could fail. Jessica reached for his hand, squeezing it gently. A silent thank you. A silent recognition that they both understood what had happened here. This wasn't justice. This was a favor. She turned her gaze back to Judge Mercer, who sat watching them carefully, his expression unreadable. And then she spoke. Her voice was quiet, but it cut through the air with a sharpness that made the entire room still. "If my son weren't the Attorney General, would you have let me rot in a cell?" A cold, devastating silence followed. No one answered, because they all knew the truth. Jessica nodded slightly, as if she had expected nothing else. Then with slow, deliberate steps, she turned toward the courtroom doors. She was free, but she wasn't sure she would ever feel free again. As Jessica stepped out of the courthouse, the crisp air hit her like a shock to the system. She had expected to feel relief, to feel the weight of injustice finally lift from her shoulders. Instead, she was met with something far bigger than herself. The street outside was packed, A sea of cameras, microphones, flashing lights, and shouting reporters surged forward the moment she appeared. Protesters lined the sidewalks, their signs raised high, their voices echoing off the courthouse walls. She had walked in alone, a woman wrongfully accused, nearly swallowed whole by a system that didn't care. But she was not alone anymore. The world had seen, and now the world was watching. The storm came swiftly. By the time Jessica and Jamal stepped out of the courthouse, the world outside had already changed. The air buzzed with tension, the streets outside swarming with reporters, cameras flashing like relentless lightning strikes. A wall of journalists stood waiting, microphones extended, voices overlapping in a chaotic frenzy. "Mrs. Carter, how do you feel after the charges were dropped?" "Mr. Carter, do you believe your mother was targeted because of racial bias? Will there be legal action against the judge and prosecution?" Jessica squinted against the blinding lights, her body stiff with exhaustion. She hadn't had a moment to breathe, process, to truly feel the weight of everything that had just happened. But the world wasn't waiting. This was no longer just her story. It was everywhere. A case that should have been nothing, a quiet, unnoticed ruling in a system built to discard people like her, had become a national headline. Elderly Black woman falsely arrested, judge and prosecutor under fire. Justice system exposed. How close did an innocent woman come to being wrongfully convicted? U.S. Attorney General's mother targeted in racial profiling. Incident civil rights groups demand accountability. The headlines scrolled across every television screen, filled every social media feed. The grainy footage of the security tape was played on a loop, dissected by analysts, reposted by celebrities, condemned by activists. The world had seen, and the world was furious. Judge Mercer sat behind his desk, staring at the blinking red light on his office phone. Another voicemail, another demand for a statement, another warning that his name was now synonymous with injustice. The courthouse had become a war zone. Protesters had gathered outside, their voices thundering through the streets. "No justice, no peace. Disbar Mercer now." The calls for his removal were deafening. His inbox overflowed with complaints, threats, demands for accountability. His reputation, carefully built over decades, was crumbling overnight. He had thought himself untouchable, but this wasn't just any case. This was a case that had been dragged into the light, and now there was nowhere to hide. Across the city, the prosecutor who had so smugly presented his case against Jessica Carter found himself in a similar nightmare. Emails flooded his office. "Resign. You are a disgrace. You almost destroyed an innocent woman's life." His boss had called twice. The second time, the words had been sharp, unforgiving. "There will be an investigation. I suggest you prepare." The White House issued a statement by morning. "The Justice Department is launching a full internal review of this case. We are committed to ensuring that the failures that led to this wrongful arrest are thoroughly investigated and that those responsible are held accountable." Jamal Carter stood before a podium that afternoon, cameras rolling, journalists packed tightly into the press room. He was no longer just a son defending his mother. He was the Attorney General of the United States demanding justice. "This case is not an isolated incident," he said, his voice steady but unyielding. "It is a reflection of a system that too often criminalizes the innocent and protects those who abuse their power. We will not allow this to be swept under the rug." The room erupted with questions. Will Judge Mercer be removed from the bench? Are you pursuing charges against the arresting officer? Does this change your stance on criminal justice reform? Jamal didn't hesitate. "We are looking at every possible course of action," and the world believed him, because he had just proven exactly how far he was willing to go. The city stretched beyond the window, a vast ocean of lights flickering against the darkness. Skyscrapers stood tall, their glass facades reflecting the neon glow of the streets below, where life carried on as if nothing had changed. Horns blared in the distance, the occasional siren piercing through the quiet hum of traffic. Jessica sat in her small apartment, a cup of tea cooling in her hands untouched. The television in the corner of the room murmured low, replaying the same footage that had been cycling through every news station for the past 24 hours. Her face, her trial, the moment her son had walked into that courtroom and turned the tide of history. She should have felt victorious. She should have felt free. But instead, she felt heavy. Her fingers traced the rim of her cup absent-mindedly as she let the weight of it all settle in. The truth had been clear, undeniable, and yet it had taken a national scandal, an army of cameras, and the most powerful prosecutor in the country stepping into the courtroom to set her free. She had begged them to check the cameras. She had pleaded for someone to listen, and no one had, not until it had become inconvenient for them to ignore her. Her reflection in the window stared back at her, lined with exhaustion, with years of wisdom and the fresh, bitter taste of a reality she had spent decades choosing not to see. She had always believed in the system. Now she knew better. The phone rang. The sharp, sudden chime cut through the silence, startling her out of her thoughts. She blinked, setting down her cup and reaching for the receiver with slow, deliberate movements. "Hello?" There was a pause, just long enough for her heart to tighten. Then Mama. Jamal's voice was steady, but she could hear the undercurrent of something deeper. Exhaustion, frustration, fury. She exhaled softly, gripping the phone a little tighter. "You should be resting," she murmured. He let out a dry, humorless chuckle. "So should you." A small silence settled between them, filled only by the distant hum of the television in the background. Then Jamal's voice dipped lower, more serious. "I need you to know something," he said. "This won't happen again." Jessica closed her eyes, swallowing against the tightness in her throat. "Jamal." "No, Mama," he cut her off, his voice firm. "This isn't just about you. This is about every person who didn't have a son who could walk into that courtroom and make them listen. This is about the people who never got their cases reopened, who never got a second chance. This system, it's broken, and I won't let it keep crushing people like you." Jessica's fingers tightened around the phone. She had spent her entire life believing in rules, in fairness, in doing things the right way. But fairness had never been part of this system, not for people like her, not for people without money, without power, without someone willing to fight for them. And yet here was her son, standing in the very heart of that system, declaring war against it. A single tear slipped down her cheek, surprising her. She hadn't realized she was crying. Jamal's voice softened. "I promise you, Mama, I'll fix this. No one else should have to go through what you did." Jessica let out a shaky breath, pressing her fingers against her temple. She had spent years worrying about him, about the weight he carried, about how much of the world's injustice he had taken upon his own shoulders. And now he was taking this too. But for the first time in 24 hours, for the first time in years, she felt something other than exhaustion. Hope. She wiped at her cheek and chuckled softly. "You always were a stubborn boy," she murmured. Jamal laughed, the sound warm despite the exhaustion beneath it. "I had a good teacher." Jessica let her head rest against the back of the chair, closing her eyes, allowing herself to breathe. The battle wasn't over, but maybe, just maybe, they had taken the first step towards something better. And for now, that was enough. Thank you for watching until this moment, and for standing with us on this journey for justice. Your support means everything. Like, subscribe, and turn on notifications so you never miss what's next. And we'd love to hear your thoughts. Leave a comment below and let us know what moved you most in this story. Together, our voices make a difference. The night outside was quiet, but Jessica's mind was anything but. She sat by the window, staring at the city beyond the skyline, stretching into the darkness. The blinking lights of distant traffic, the world moving forward as if nothing had happened. As if she hadn't just spent the last 24 hours being dragged through a system that had been prepared to discard her without a second thought. The injustice of it sat heavy in her chest. But what haunted her more, what truly unsettled her, was the question she couldn't shake. How many others? How many people had sat in that same cold jail cell, staring at the same cracked walls, their wrists sore from too tight handcuffs, their dignity stripped away? How many had begged for someone to listen, only to be met with silence? She had been lucky. Lucky. The word itself made her stomach turn. She had nearly lost everything over a crime she hadn't committed. Not because there was evidence against her. Not because the truth was unclear, but because it had been easier for them to believe she was guilty. It had taken her son, the United States Attorney General, storming into that courtroom to undo the damage. But what about the people who had no one? The ones without powerful sons? The ones who had no cameras to capture their wrongful arrests? No reporters outside the courthouse demanding justice? No viral outrage to force the system to acknowledge their existence? Where were they now? Jessica thought of the young woman she had met in that holding cell. She had been no older than 25, her eyes weary, her body curled into itself like she had spent a lifetime making herself smaller. Her crime? Taking a granola bar. For my little girl, she had whispered, shame thick in her voice. She was hungry. Jessica had seen the resignation in her eyes, the quiet acceptance of a fate she knew she could not fight. Would that young woman be released? Would someone come for her? Or would she disappear into the system, another name on another case file, processed and forgotten? How many had already been buried this way? How many innocent men and women had their futures stolen by judges like Mercer, by prosecutors who cared more about conviction rates than truth? She imagined them faces she would never see, names she would never know. Some of them sitting behind bars right now, serving sentences for crimes they didn't commit. Others having already spent years, decades behind concrete walls, their stories untold, their innocence meaningless against the weight of a system designed to grind them down. How many had screamed for someone to listen? How many had been silenced? Jessica felt a deep, slow-burning anger rise in her chest. This wasn't just about her anymore. This was about all of them. She had seen the headlines, the protests, the calls for reform. The world was watching now, but for how long? Would this outrage fade? Would the cameras move on to the next scandal, the next injustice, leaving the forgotten ones behind once again? Or was this the moment when something finally changed? Jessica didn't know. But what she did know was this: she was no longer afraid, and she would not be silent. Jessica Carter was nearly swallowed by a system that did not care about truth, only convenience. A system that had already decided she was guilty before she ever spoke a word. But she is not the only one. How many innocent people have been thrown behind bars, forgotten, simply because they didn't have a voice loud enough to be heard? How many have lost their freedom, their dignity, their lives because no one was watching? This must end. Justice should not depend on power. It should not depend on influence. It should not take national outrage to free the innocent. It should be a right. So what can we do? Raise your voice. Share this story. Keep the conversation alive. Demand accountability. Judges like Mercer, prosecutors who abuse their power, they thrive on silence. They rely on the world looking away. Don't look away. Support organizations fighting for the wrongly accused. Demand better policies, better oversight. Call out injustice when you see it. Because today it was Jessica Carter. Tomorrow it could be someone you love. Justice should not be a privilege. It should be for everyone. But that only happens if we fight for it. This is more than just a story. It is a fight for justice. Jessica Carter was nearly buried by a system that never intended to give her a chance. If not for the undeniable evidence, the public outrage, and the intervention of her powerful son, she might still be sitting in a cold jail cell. Another innocent person lost in a system that thrives on silence. But what about those who don't have a voice? How many others are still trapped, falsely accused, unable to fight back? How many stories just like Jessica's go unheard, dismissed, and forgotten? We cannot let this continue. That is why we need you. Hit the like button to show your support for this cause. Every interaction helps push this message further, making sure this injustice is seen, heard, and remembered. Share this video with your friends, family, and across your social media. The more people who see this, the harder it becomes for those in power to ignore. Real change happens when we refuse to look away. Subscribe so you never miss another powerful story like this. We are committed to exposing the truth, to shining a light on the cases that matter, and to keeping the pressure on a broken system that needs to change. Together, we are stronger. Jessica's fight does not end here. Justice should not be reserved for the privileged. It should be a right for everyone. But it will take all of us to make that a reality. Let's keep the conversation alive. Let's fight for justice. Join us. Take action. Be part of the change.